The world that rose from the ashes of 1945 was not a world healed, but one divided. From the ruins of Berlin to the ports of San Francisco, a strange tension settled over humanity, a silence heavier than war itself. Two victors stood alone at the top of the wreckage, the United States and the Soviet Union. Both claimed to have saved civilization. Both now looked across oceans and saw not allies but rivals. Europe was broken, and the vacuum it left became the battleground for everything that followed. The Americans believed they were defending liberty, rebuilding a world in their own image. Open markets, open borders, open dreams. The Soviets believed they were defending justice, ensuring that the sacrifices of 20 million dead would lead to equality, not exploitation. Between those visions lay the future of the planet. It did not take long for the lines to harden. The Iron Curtain fell across Europe. Berlin was carved like a wound, half blue, half red. Propaganda replaced diplomacy. The nuclear age began, and with it came a new kind of warfare, psychological, cultural, symbolic. Guns could not be fired, so nations competed in every other form imaginable: space, science, art, and sport. To the ordinary citizen, the Olympics were still a celebration of peace. But to governments, they had become a stage on which ideology could be measured in seconds and centimeters. A gold medal was no longer a personal triumph. It was proof that one system produced superior human beings. The United States entered the post-war years confident in its athletic dominance. American universities were fountains of talent. Their athletes trained freely without state control, nurtured by a culture that celebrated individual excellence. When they won, they smiled, they thanked God, and they waved the flag of democracy. In the East, Stalin watched carefully. The Soviet Union had sacrificed more than any other nation to defeat Nazi Germany. Now it demanded recognition, not through speeches or treaties but through visible superiority. Stalin understood that medals could be as powerful as missiles. Each victory was a message to the working class of the world: see what socialism creates. Throughout the late 1940s, the Soviet government began constructing its sports empire. Entire academies were founded, hidden behind barbed wire and secrecy, to produce athletes like weapons. Coaches became engineers of the body, designing training programs rooted in science, discipline, and ideology. Every champion was expected to serve as a model of the Soviet citizen: obedient, strong, tireless, selfless. Failure was not personal, it was political. The Western press knew little of these preparations. To them, the USSR was still an enigma, a land of parades and silence. The Cold War's first years were defined by mutual suspicion, and that suspicion seeped into the realm of sport long before the two sides ever met in competition. When London hosted the first post-war Olympics in 1948, the Soviet Union declined to participate. Officially, they were rebuilding. In truth, they were waiting, studying their future adversaries, preparing for an entrance that would shake the world. Behind closed doors, Soviet committees debated how to dominate the games once they arrived. "When we go," said one sports official, "we must never lose." 4 years later, in 1952, they came. The Helsinki Games would mark the first appearance of the Soviet Union in modern Olympic history. For the IOC, it was a moment of triumph. The world's great powers, East and West, together again in peaceful competition. But beneath the smiles and the speeches, everyone knew what was at stake. The Americans arrived with confidence. They were the heirs of the pre-war tradition: relaxed, athletic, charismatic. Their coaches spoke of teamwork and fair play. The Soviets arrived like soldiers. Their delegation numbered more than 500, the largest ever seen. They brought their own translators, doctors, even cooks. No outsider was allowed near the athletes. They trained in isolation, carried their own food, their own ideology, their own universe. When the teams marched into the Olympic Stadium during the opening ceremony, the difference was visible to all. The Americans waved and smiled, tossing baseball caps to the crowd. The Soviets marched in formation, eyes fixed ahead, movements perfectly synchronized. To one side stood democracy, to the other, discipline. Between them stood history. Once the competitions began, the rivalry ignited. Every event, boxing, gymnastics, track and field, became a proxy for political supremacy. Newspapers described it like a war fought without bullets. When an American sprinter faces a Russian, wrote one columnist, freedom races against communism. And freedom did not always win. The Soviet athletes were extraordinary, strong, relentless, and meticulously trained. In Helsinki they captured gold in weightlifting, wrestling, and gymnastics. They seemed built from iron, embodiments of their homeland's endurance. The Americans still dominated swimming and track, their natural arenas, but for the first time in history they could feel another empire breathing down their neck. By the end of the Games, the final medal tally stunned the world. The United States had won 40 golds. The Soviet Union, its first appearance ever, had won 22. It was a statement written not in words but in numbers. The communist system could compete with the capitalist one on equal footing. In Moscow the celebration was immense. Stalin himself, frail and nearing death, was briefed on every victory. Soviet propaganda posters filled the streets. Women gymnasts soaring through the air under the Red Star, wrestlers grappling under slogans that read, "The people's strength is the nation's pride." The USSR had entered the Olympics not as a guest but as a power. In Washington the mood was mixed. There was pride but also unease. For decades, the United States had used its athletic dominance as proof of its moral and cultural superiority. Now that dominance was under threat. A new front in the Cold War had opened, and it was one that could not be fought with tanks. The athletes themselves, those who stood on the tracks and fields, were often the least ideological. Many had exchanged words and smiles with their supposed enemies. A Soviet discus thrower and an American shot putter had shared coffee in the Olympic Village, laughing over the universal ache of muscles and nerves. But when they returned home, those friendships vanished behind borders of propaganda. Each was portrayed as a warrior who had humiliated the enemy. The human story disappeared beneath the weight of politics. As the Helsinki Games closed, one journalist wrote, "These Olympics were not about sport. They were about the future of mankind." He was not wrong. The Cold War had found its perfect theater, clean, controlled, and televised. A battlefield where bullets were replaced by medals, where ideology could be wrapped in the innocence of play. It was a competition no one could stop because both sides needed it. For the United States, victory meant moral leadership. For the Soviet Union, victory meant proof of progress. For both, defeat was unthinkable. And so, as the athletes left Finland under the northern sun, the next chapter was already being written. Coaches began drafting new programs. Governments increased funding. Intelligence agencies began to take interest in the physiological secrets of sport. The Olympic ideal, born in peace, was now enlisted in a war that would last half a century. The world had changed. The arena had become a battlefield, and the crowd did not yet understand that the most important contest of the modern age had already begun. When Joseph Stalin died in 1953, the Soviet Union did not relax its grip on sport. If anything, it tightened. Power changed hands, the fears softened slightly, but the mission remained. The arena was the front line of ideology. Under Nikita Khrushchev, the USSR declared that socialism would overtake and surpass the West in every field, factories, farms, and fields of play. The party spoke of the new Soviet man, and nowhere could he be displayed more dramatically than beneath the Olympic flame. The 1956 Melbourne Games became the first real confrontation between the matured superpowers. The Soviets arrived as defending champions of purpose, the Americans as defenders of pride. The stadium smelled of eucalyptus and tension. The Cold War was at its most brittle. The Hungarian uprising had been crushed weeks earlier, tanks rolling through Budapest while Moscow called it restoring order. When Hungarian and Soviet athletes met in the pool for the water polo semi-final, the political war burst into blood. The match began civilly enough, but every shove carried history. Halfway through the game, Hungarian Ervin Zador surfaced with his face split open by a Soviet elbow. Blood spread through the water like ink. The crowd erupted, security rushed in, and the match was abandoned. Hungary won 4-0, but the score meant little. The image of blood in the pool was broadcast around the world, a perfect, horrifying symbol of an era where sport could no longer pretend to be innocent. Moscow spun its narrative, Washington spun its own. Each side claimed moral victory. Yet behind the propaganda, athletes on both teams carried guilt and exhaustion. They had been pawns in something larger than sport, trapped in a current neither could escape. After Melbourne, the pattern was set. Every games became another battle in a war fought with stopwatches and flags. The Soviets expanded their sports academies into a network that touched every republic of the Union. Children as young as 5 were measured, tested, catalogued. If their bodies promised potential, they were taken into specialized schools where life became a laboratory of movement. Coaches became state scientists. Medals were not personal achievements, they were quotas. Failure was treated as betrayal, success as service to the revolution. In the United States, the response was slower, less centralized but equally determined. Universities became the new front lines. College scholarships multiplied, training facilities grew. The American system celebrated individuality, the myth of the self-made champion. Its propaganda was freedom itself. Men and women who succeeded not because they were ordered to but because they chose to. Yet beneath the rhetoric, the pressure was just as fierce. Losing to the Soviets was unthinkable. Every American athlete knew that his or her victory would be used to prove that liberty bred strength. By 1960, the Cold War had entered the space race and the sports race at the same fever pitch. Rome hosted the 17 Olympiad under the Mediterranean sun, and for 2 weeks, the Eternal City became the center of an impermanent empire shared by red and blue. The Soviets fielded gymnasts who seemed carved from marble, Larissa Ladynina, graceful and unshakable, the embodiment of Soviet womanhood. She won 6 medals in Rome, her smile precise, her posture unbroken. The West admired her and feared her in equal measure. She became the most decorated female Olympian in history, her face printed on stamps across the USSR. Meanwhile, the United States found its new heroes in track and field. Wilma Rudolph, the fastest woman on earth, sprinted out of segregation and childhood polio to win 3 gold medals. Her triumph in Rome stood as both athletic brilliance and moral contrast. America's democracy showing, however imperfectly, its capacity for renewal. Yet even her story was drawn into the same orbit of ideology. The Soviet press praised her talent but used her success to condemn the racial hypocrisy of the United States. In the Cold War, every victory was a weapon even against the winner. Between games, espionage seeped into training. Intelligence agencies collected information on nutrition, altitude effects, recovery methods. Soviet coaches studied American psychology, Americans analyzed Soviet biomechanics. Rumors of secret drugs began to circulate, whispers of laboratories where strength was chemically engineered. Neither side admitted it, but both were already exploring science beyond sport. The contest of systems had no moral limits. When Tokyo hosted in 1964, Japan symbolized rebirth, Asia rising from war. The Cold War followed it eastward. The USSR arrived with its Red Machine in full force. Gymnasts, fencers, wrestlers, all drilled to perfection. They marched with stoic unity, their anthem echoing through newly rebuilt arenas. The Americans, adaptable as ever, countered with charisma. Sprinters who smiled, swimmers who waved to the cameras, decathletes who spoke of friendship across borders. Beneath the surface, every smile concealed calculation. Each medal table at the end of the day was read like a battle report. By then, smaller nations had begun to choose sides. Eastern Europe produced its own prodigies under Moscow's system. Czechs, Poles, East Germans, all feeding into the bloc's medal machine. The West responded through alliances, pooling coaches, sharing research. The Olympics, meant to unite nations, had become a map of alliances in motion. 1968 was the year everything changed again. Mexico City stood at high altitude, thin air above a restless continent. The world beyond the stadium was burning: Vietnam, Prague, Paris, Detroit. Youth rebellion challenged both East and West. Inside the Olympic Village, the tension of global unrest met the discipline of the Games, and something unprecedented happened. Athletes themselves began to speak. When American sprinters Tommy Smith and John Carlos raised black-gloved fists during the medal ceremony for the 200 meters, They shattered the fragile neutrality of sport. For the first time, protests stood on the podium. The gesture was condemned by officials but echoed by millions. The Soviets denounced it as proof of Western hypocrisy. American authorities called it a disgrace. Yet history would see it as courage. The Cold War Olympics had produced not only soldiers of ideology but rebels of conscience. That same year, behind the Iron Curtain, another rebellion rose, Czechoslovakia's Prague Spring, crushed by Soviet tanks while their athletes trained for Mexico. When those Czechoslovak gymnasts competed under the flag of the same nation that had invaded them, the hypocrisy was unbearable. The Olympics had become a mirror where every ideal reflected its opposite. By the end of the 1960s, the scoreboard of the world was balanced on a knife edge. The United States and the Soviet Union traded first place like a pendulum. One year red, the next blue. Every child in both empires grew up knowing the numbers by heart. It was no longer sport, it was national theology. The athletes aged, retired, or defected. Some escaped the East during overseas competitions, seeking freedom. Others, caught trying, vanished into silence. Each defection was a story of its own. A gymnast hiding in a friend's car, a fencer running across a runway at night, a weightlifter slipping into a Western embassy. The Western press portrayed them as brave souls fleeing tyranny. Soviet media branded them traitors seduced by capitalist lies. Either way, they were evidence of the human cost behind the medals. The Red Machine had proven its power. From Melbourne to Mexico, it had reshaped the meaning of athleticism. Its gymnasts moved like precision clocks. Its weightlifters lifted as if gravity were ideological. The American style remained freer, improvisational, fueled by college rivalries and commercial sponsorships. The contrast defined a generation: control versus creativity, system versus spirit. As 1968 ended, the world exhaled into a moment of uneasy balance. The nuclear standoff remained, the space race raged, the medal count stood almost even. But beneath those numbers, something deeper had shifted. The Olympics were no longer merely a reflection of the Cold War, they were one of its driving engines. They had given the superpowers a way to compete without annihilation, a ritualized battle that satisfied pride and postponed disaster. The games were a substitute war, fought in slow motion every 4 years. And yet, as the 1970s approached, that ritual would grow darker still. Science would become weaponized, politics would tighten its grip, and the myth of pure sport would be tested beyond recognition. The Red Machine was at its peak, but it was already sowing the seeds of its own decline. The 1970s opened with the illusion of calm. The missiles were silent, the leaders smiled for cameras, and the superpowers spoke of détente. But beneath the diplomacy, the race for supremacy had simply changed costume. The Cold War had learned to move through laboratories and locker rooms instead of trenches. It was no longer about survival, it was about appearance. Each side wanted to look immortal. By 1972, that illusion shimmered like gold under the Bavarian sun. Munich was meant to be the Games of Peace, a gentle contrast to the grim militarism of Berlin 1936. West Germany had rebuilt itself from rubble and wanted to show the world a new face: democratic, cultured, humane. For once, the Olympics seemed ready to return to innocence. They never would. The Americans arrived confident, the Soviets colder and more professional than ever, and both sides soon felt the pressure of something larger than sport. Every photograph, every race, every handshake was analyzed for meaning. In this tension, perfection looked beautiful and impossible. Then, before dawn on the 5th of September, that illusion was broken forever. A group of armed men from the Palestinian organization Black September scaled the fence of the Olympic Village and took 11 Israeli athletes hostage. The crisis unfolded in real time. Television cables carried the images of masked faces and police snipers to millions. For 20 hours the world watched, helpless, until gunfire tore through the darkness at a nearby airfield. The hostages were killed. The terrorists were killed. The police were killed. The games were stained with blood. The Munich massacre changed everything. It revealed that even this most symbolic space of peace could be invaded by the violence of history. For the superpowers, the tragedy became another mirror of ideology. The United States mourned publicly and called for strength. The Soviet Union blamed Western chaos and imperial hypocrisy. Once again, grief became propaganda. When the Games resumed after a single day of silence, many athletes competed through tears. Among them was an American swimmer, Mark Spitz, who had already won 7 gold medals before being rushed out of Germany under armed guard because he was Jewish. His victories were rewritten by the shadow of the massacre. The medals shone, but the light felt wrong. Even triumph now carried mourning. In gymnastics, the Soviet Union continued its quiet revolution. Olga Korbut, the sparrow from Minsk, smiled shyly as she performed moves no one had seen before, backflips on the uneven bars, acrobatics that defied imagination. She became a symbol of innocence amid tragedy, the face of the USSR that the Kremlin wanted the world to love. Millions did. For the first time, a Soviet athlete was adored in the West not as an enemy but as a miracle. Yet her fame also revealed the system's cruelty, the pressure, the control, the manipulation of youth in service of image. Behind every performance lay exhaustion and fear. By the end of Munich, both superpowers had learned the same lesson. Perfection was powerful and perfection could be engineered. Science replaced training, chemistry replaced willpower. Laboratories in Moscow, East Berlin, and Washington hummed with secret research. Muscles were measured, hormones manipulated, diets regulated to the molecule. Sport was now a branch of the arms race. 4 years later, Montreal carried the illusion to its peak. The stadiums gleamed white, the maple leaf fluttered in the summer wind, and the East German anthem played again and again as women with impossible strength and shoulders of iron crushed records that would stand for decades. Their faces were young, their voices deepened by steroids they did not know they were taking. Coaches called it vitamins. The state called it science. The world called it glory. In that same summer, a 14-year-old Romanian named Nadia Comaneci floated across the balance beam and landed history's first perfect 10. The scoreboard froze, incapable of displaying 2 digits before the decimal. The crowd gasped, then roared. She was tiny, expressionless, perfect. Exactly what the system demanded. The East celebrated her as proof of socialist purity, the West admired her as art. Behind her quiet face stood the brutal coaching of Bela Karolyi and the invisible hand of politics that had sculpted a child into an idol. Perfection had become propaganda. The United States tried to respond with charisma. Bruce Jenner's decathlon gold, the smiling embodiment of self-made heroism. Sugar Ray Leonard's quicksilver boxing. The swimmers of Indiana sweeping through the water. But even as they won, the mood shifted. The joy of sport was hardening into theater. Medals were now currency in a psychological economy that measured ideology rather than humanity. By the late 1970s, the two empires had perfected their systems and lost their innocence. The Soviet Red Machine expanded through its satellites. East Germany became a factory of champions, its secret police cataloging every pill, every pulse, every breath. The United States answered with money, sponsorships, and new training technologies born from corporate research. The myth of amateurism collapsed. Athletes became state projects or commercial products. The Olympic rings still promised unity, but their colors now mirrored political divisions. Then came Moscow 1980. The decade had begun with hope, brief, fragile, the kind that flickers before a storm. In December 1979, Soviet tanks rolled into Afghanistan, and the fragile peace between East and West shattered. President Jimmy Carter, under pressure at home and abroad, demanded the ultimate retaliation, a boycott of the Moscow Games. It was the first time the Olympics themselves became a direct casualty of war. For the athletes who had trained their entire lives, the decision felt like betrayal. 4 years of sweat and sacrifice erased by politics. Some protested, others obeyed. 60 nations refused to go to Moscow, those who went marched under neutral flags. In the empty lanes and half-filled arenas, Soviet athletes competed mostly against themselves, collecting record numbers of medals while Western cameras filmed the silence. The Kremlin staged magnificence, fireworks, choirs, parades of children. The image of peace was painted brighter than ever to hide the isolation beneath. But everyone knew the truth. The Olympics had become an instrument of war by other means. The victory of 1980 was hollow, echoing across vacant grandstands. For the athletes of both blocks, the decade ended in disillusion. Many of the champions of Montreal were already broken by drugs or neglect. Others had disappeared into anonymity, their bodies paying the bill for victories that no longer mattered. The Games, once imagined as a festival of youth, had aged into spectacle, grand, magnificent, and merciless. The Cold War had turned sport into a mirror of the century, glorious and tragic, brilliant and corrupt. The illusion still shone, but the cracks were widening. In 4 short years, the boycotts would return in reverse, the Iron Curtain would begin to rust, and the world would watch as the Red Machine started to collapse under the weight of its own perfection. When the torches of Moscow 1980 dimmed, they left behind not the warmth of peace but the chill of absence. For the first time the Olympic flame had burned almost alone. The Soviet Union had won easily, but victory without an opponent felt like an echo in an empty hall. The medal tables glowed red, the anthems thundered, yet even those who stood on the podiums knew the applause was thinner than it sounded. The Cold War had devoured the games themselves. In Washington, the decision to boycott Moscow was celebrated as moral strength. But among athletes, it left scars that never healed. 4 years of work dissolved into speeches and politics. Some retired in silence. Others carried bitterness that would last a lifetime. The spirit of the Olympics, wounded by propaganda, limped into the new decade. For the Soviets, revenge was inevitable. When Los Angeles won the right to host the 1984 Games, the Kremlin prepared its answer. The official statement came in May. The USSR and its allies would not participate, citing concerns for the safety of our athletes. Everyone knew the truth, it was retaliation. The tit-for-tat boycotts completed the ruin of the Olympic ideal. The Games of Peace had become diplomatic hostages. Los Angeles responded with defiance. The city staged its games without public money, funded by television rights and corporate sponsorships. It was capitalism turned into pageant. Hollywood orchestras, neon lights, a space-age opening ceremony with jetpacks and pop stars. Where Moscow had paraded soldiers, Los Angeles paraded brands. The contrast was total, the free market versus the 5-year plan. And without the Eastern Bloc, the Americans dominated the medals. Carl Lewis flew down the track, repeating Jesse Owens's 4 golds from Berlin. Mary Lou Retton, a teenager with a smile bright enough to light the entire stadium, became the first American woman to win the all-around gymnastics title. The United States turned athleticism into entertainment, triumph into television. Ratings soared, sponsors multiplied, and the Olympic movement discovered a new addiction: profit. In Moscow the broadcasts were muted. State television showed limited footage, emphasizing Western decadence, materialism, the circus of capitalism. But younger Soviet viewers secretly admired what they saw: the color, the freedom, the joy. The propaganda machine had begun to falter, its messages hollow against the evidence of laughter on the screen. Behind the Iron Curtain, athletes felt the cost of isolation. The training continued, morning drills, endless repetition, but without international competition, motivation eroded. The medals of 1980 gathered dust. Coaches grew harsher, demanding loyalty as substitute for purpose. Doping programs, now institutionalized, filled the gap left by lost inspiration. Victory had become chemical. By 1985, a new figure rose in the Kremlin: Mikhail Gorbachev. His policies, glasnost and perestroika, spoke of openness, restructuring, a breath of fresh air after decades of discipline. But within sport, the system was too entrenched to change overnight. Funding shrank, facilities decayed, yet expectations remained absolute. The Red Machine creaked but continued to move. Seoul 1988 was chosen as the next host, and both superpowers prepared to meet again after 8 years of separation. For athletes on both sides, it felt like a reunion after exile. The Soviets, desperate to prove resilience, poured their remaining resources into preparation. The Americans, now veterans of commercialized sport, arrived with new confidence and an army of sponsors behind them. The world that gathered in Seoul was no longer the world of 1952. Television satellites orbited overhead, broadcasting every heat and dive in real time. The image of rivalry had become global theater. The Soviet Union still fielded champions, gymnasts who floated like ghosts, boxers with granite chins, rowers whose backs seemed carved from iron, but cracks showed through the perfection. Whispers of defection spread again. Some athletes used foreign competitions as doors to freedom, disappearing after the final event, leaving uniforms and flags behind like shed skin. For the United States, Seoul offered vindication. Their athletes competed with exuberance that felt less ideological and more human. Florence Griffith Joyner streaked down the track like a living flame, her speed surreal, her style flamboyant. Greg Louganis dove with impossible grace even after striking his head on the board, returned and won. These were victories that transcended the old propaganda. They belonged not to systems but to individuals. Yet even as the stadium roared, scandal lingered at the edges. Canada's Ben Johnson, hailed as the fastest man alive, tested positive for steroids the day after his record-shattering win. The revelation shocked the world and confirmed what many had whispered for years. The pursuit of dominance had corrupted everyone. Doping was no longer an Eastern secret. It was a global epidemic. The dream of pure competition had been buried under chemistry. In the Soviet camp, similar secrets festered but remained hidden. State doctors adjusted dosages, destroyed evidence, rewrote medical records. Glory had become a clinical equation. Even as the USSR topped the medal table in Seoul, the victory felt brittle, haunted by rumors and by the exhaustion of a system approaching its end. Outside the stadiums, change was accelerating. Eastern Europe trembled with unrest, economies faltered, walls cracked. In Moscow, Gorbachev spoke of reform while bureaucrats clung to old certainties. The propaganda posters of smiling athletes looked like relics from another century. The people had new concerns: food, freedom, the future. The age of total control was ending, and with it, the empire of medals. By the time the Olympic flame was extinguished in Seoul, something irreversible had shifted. The Cold War was dying, and the games that had mirrored it for 40 years were left without their defining conflict. The athletes marched together in the closing ceremony, east beside west, waving flags of nations that would soon cease to exist. For a moment it looked like peace. For a moment, the dream seemed possible again. But history rarely ends neatly. The decade ahead would bring collapse, reunification, and revelation. Files would open, secrets spill, champions fade. The metals of the Cold War would tarnish into evidence. And yet, from that decay, something new would grow. A different kind of strength, born not from ideology but from the simple human desire to run faster, jump higher, and breathe freely. The last years of the Cold War felt like the slow uncoiling of a spring that had been wound too tight for too long. The Soviet Union, once a machine of iron certainty, began to rust from within. Cracks appeared first in whispers, then in streets. What had seemed eternal now felt temporary. And as the system trembled, so too did its proudest creation, the empire of sport. The Berlin Wall, that concrete scoreboard dividing the world, began to fracture. At first it was only rumors, border guards looking the other way, young East Germans testing the edges of freedom. Then in November 1989 the wall fell. The images raced across television screens, hammers striking stone, families climbing over barbed wire, strangers embracing under floodlights. It was more than a political moment, it was the end of a century's duel. For decades, the Olympic rivalry between the USA and the USSR had mirrored this wall. Every record, every medal, every ceremony had reinforced its existence. When it fell, the meaning of victory itself changed. The flags that had once opposed each other now fluttered side by side, confused and beautiful. The world had grown tired of choosing sides. Inside the Soviet sports system, the fall of the wall felt like the collapse of gravity. Funding disappeared overnight. Training centers that had been temples of ideology stood silent. Coaches went unpaid. Athletes who had lived their entire lives inside the state's embrace suddenly found themselves free and terrified. The structure that had controlled them for decades had also protected them. Now there was nothing left but uncertainty. Some emigrated, joining Western teams or becoming private coaches abroad. Others retired, their records intact but their futures empty. A few, realizing they had been part of something darker, began to speak. Doctors confessed to experiments. Athletes admitted to injections they never understood. The truth came out piece by piece. Systemic doping programs, falsified documents, children trained beyond endurance. The myth of moral superiority dissolved under the light of reality. In the West, triumph felt hollow. The United States had won the Cold War, but against what? The enemy was gone, the rivalry over, yet the emptiness of victory lingered. For 40 years, American sport had defined itself by opposition. Without the Soviet shadow, it struggled to remember why it competed. The Olympics had been an ideological mirror, now it reflected only itself. And yet, in that vacuum, something quietly hopeful began to form. The Games of 1992 in Barcelona arrived like dawn after a long storm. The Soviet Union no longer existed. In its place marched a group called the Unified Team. Athletes from the newly independent republics wearing white uniforms and carrying the Olympic flag. They entered the stadium not as enemies but as survivors. For the first time in half a century, the world saw them not as representatives of an ideology, but as people. The Americans cheered them. Old rivals shook hands. On the podiums, former foes stood side by side, their anthems replaced by Beethoven's Ode to Joy. The symbolism was overwhelming. The Cold War, once fought in every muscle and heartbeat, had melted into history. The athletes who had been raised to see each other as adversaries now saw each other as reflections, two halves of the same human pursuit. Barcelona shimmered with color and possibility. The city itself, reborn from decades of dictatorship, mirrored the new world emerging from division. When the archer lit the Olympic cauldron with a flaming arrow, it felt as if the fire that had once divided the planet had finally been turned into light. The games belonged again to humanity, not ideology. But history never ends cleanly. Beneath the celebration, the consequences of the Cold War's Olympic arms race lingered in bodies and memories. Many of the athletes of the Eastern Bloc carried permanent injuries, damaged hearts, shattered joints. Some lived with the quiet bitterness of knowing they had been used. Others, in small towns and faded apartments, clung to their medals as proof that their suffering had meant something. In the West, commercialism had replaced propaganda, but the hunger for spectacle remained the same. Corporations now filled the role once played by the state. The colors of the Cold War faded into the logos of sponsors, the battlefields of ideology replaced by markets of profit. The games were still magnificent, but innocence, once lost, is never truly found again. And yet, through all of this, something human persisted. Sport had survived the systems that tried to own it. The runners still ran, the swimmers still dove, the gymnasts still soared. The flags changed, the borders shifted, but the movement endured. The ancient rhythm of competition, the need to measure oneself against the impossible. Looking back, it is hard to say who truly won the Cold War Olympics. The United States ended with more medals overall, but the Soviet Union had achieved something more profound. It had forced the world to take sport seriously as culture, as science, as identity. Together they had reshaped the games into the global phenomenon they are today, both a triumph and a warning. The price of that triumph was high. Thousands of young lives bent to ideology, entire generations taught that victory was the only virtue, the human spirit used as ammunition in a war of symbols. But perhaps, without that intensity, the world would never have learned how powerful sport could be, how a single race, a single jump, a single gesture could define an era. When the Soviet flag was lowered for the last time, it did not feel like the end of an enemy. It felt like the closing of a story too vast for heroes and villains. The Cold War Olympics had begun as a contest of systems and ended as a story of people, brilliant, flawed, extraordinary people who carried the hopes of nations heavier than gold. Today the medal tables remain carved into history books. But the true legacy lies elsewhere, in the quiet moments after the anthem, when the cameras fade and the athletes, stripped of flags and politics, become only human again. Because in the end, that is what remains when empires fall. The simple, undefeated will to move forward, to strive, to compete, to dream. The Cold War ended, but the Olympic flame burned on. Proof that even the fiercest rivalries can give birth not only to division but to greatness. For nearly half a century, the Olympics were the stage upon which two superpowers performed their struggle for the soul of the world. They turned games into geopolitics, athletes into soldiers, victory into ideology. But when the smoke cleared, the medals lost their weight and the systems that produced them collapsed into memory. What remained were stories, of courage, of betrayal, of pride and pain. Stories that outlived the banners that inspired them. Stories that proved one eternal truth. No matter who claims it, the human spirit belongs to no empire. The stadiums are silent now. The flags have changed. The rivals are gone. But somewhere in a track bathed in morning light, a young athlete ties their shoes, takes a breath and begins to run. And in that motion the Cold War never truly ended. It transformed, as all history does, into memory.